Today is Wednesday, August 17th, 2011, and my name is Anne Marie Poise. I am interviewing Leona Stoecker, who was a founding member of the Longmont League of Women Voters in the 1960s. And during those years to the present, she has had a remarkable career as a public servant. She is best known as Longmont's mayor, serving from 1993 to 2001. Recently, the Boulder County Business Report has called her public servant extraordinaire. This interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program. The interview is being filmed by Jenna Woods. Leona, my first question to you is for you to tell us when and where you were born.
I was born October 17th, 1934. My background is not unique. My father raised beautiful registered shorthorn cattle on a farm just outside of a very small town, Bazine, Kansas. I had a very happy childhood, though marked with the usual sadness. My grandmother lived with us, and she was an invalid. My father helped take care of her. My mother unfortunately died when I was just 6 years old. My aunt, who had not married, stayed with us and helped raise me until my father married 16 years later, or 10 years later when I was 16. I went to a small town, junior high, high school. It was always interesting for me because I was very involved in activities. I was in the band. I was the salutatorian of the class, which is not a big thing in a small school. But I always remember one of my favorite teachers telling me that I was a big fish in a little pond, and it was time that I was a little fish in a big pond. And she suggested that I go to Kansas State University, which I did, and it was a joy just to sit back and, in a way, sort of hide from all of the wonderful support that I'd had all of those years, but just be. Of course, I was active in college, but nothing to the extent that I had been in high school.
Were you or other members of your family active in civic issues while you were growing up?
My father was on the school board. We were a very giving family. That's just the way we were raised. If someone needed help, my father, whoever, was there to help. And so I suppose that may have set a pattern for me. I just assumed that's the way everyone lived. If you need help, you assist. And so that was part of my growing up years.
And were there other things during your growing up years that you think might have shaped your tremendous energy and subsequent life to, a life of giving, a life of involvement in the community?
I was trying to think of that, and I was involved at the time. It sounds archaic now, and it was the FHA, the Future Homemakers of America. And it was, they developed leadership. And this little farm girl, and I always baked the biscuits rather than be outside. That was I loved being inside, and I love to cook and still do to this day. I was trying to think if that sort of helped me develop some of the skills that apparently I have. And in that group, Future Homemakers of America, it was the equivalent for the males was Future Farmers of America. And I was elected to a state office. I didn't think much about it at the time. It was just something that just happened. And I seem to have been prepared for it in some way, I think. When I left college after I was in my junior year, I had met my future husband, and he was graduating, and was going into the Air Force for 3 years. I then went to the University of Arizona when he was in pilot training, and I immediately involved myself with one of my instructors who was a visiting nurse. And so I went with her to visit in some of the homes, and it left an indelible impression on me because I called on with her on someone who had severe rheumatoid arthritis. And I realized in my later years then I did hospitalization or hospital visits for 8 years for my church. I never wanted to be a nurse, never had any interest in the medical field, but I think having been raised in a home with an ailing grandmother, that I had compassion for people. And it was something I really enjoyed doing, was going to visit people who were ill. So that was another aspect of my life, I think, and then we moved quite often, and that was sort of the beginning then of another sort of avocation, I guess you could say.
Well, that gives some great insights into how you were shaped to become the person you did. Just as an aside, when you went to college, did you study politics, or what was your major?
My major was elementary education and home economics, which now is nutrition. I've always been very interested in nutrition. And that sort of led me to the first career. There were certainly intervening things in between, and perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself and shouldn't share yet about that because it's not quite as sequential as when I start sharing about the political activism.
Okay, now we know you're not a Longmont native, but if you would, could you tell us when and why you came to Longmont?
Yes, we were living in Arvada after my husband was out of the military. He was looking for a job with the airline, and that wasn't easy to get at the time, so he went with the Federal Aviation Agency, which was the Air Route Traffic Control Center at Stapleton at the time. And I then, for some reason, became involved in political work. I went door to door handing out pamphlets. And it was interesting because at the time, they didn't seem to want partisan pamphlets. They asked about the League of Women Voters. So that was my cue. And then, as you may know, the Air Traffic Control Center was moved from Stapleton to Longmont. So that was when we moved to Longmont in 1962. And I looked at my notes, and in April of, I thought it started immediately, but apparently it didn't. I did get a few years rest. In 1965 is when the Longmont League, the Provisional League of Women Voters in Longmont was started, and that was, I served them as the first provisional president of the Longmont League of Women Voters.
Just to back up a teeny bit, just some of your observations on political, social, economic life in Longmont in those years of the 60s.
Longmont was a community of 12,000 people when we moved here. The Air Route Traffic Control Center was really the impetus for a massive change in Longmont. A group of businessmen had gotten together, donated land, were very anxious to have a changing scene from very much a rural agricultural community to one that was very, very different. So coming from a community that was 12,000 people, the lot that we purchased to build our first house was actually a cow pasture. It's a very lovely home now. We sold it. It was recently on the Symphony Garden Tour. And we built another house nearby. My husband could have really walked to work. It was near the air traffic control center.
Mm-hmm.
So there's vast differences from when we first moved here to present day Longmont.
Okay, now, as you said, you were a founding member of the Longmont League, and could you talk about the founding of the league? And
Yes, I could. And as a provisional league, the first thing you do is a Know Your Town survey. I can't think of a better way to begin a career of public service than to really know what exists, how it operates, what's necessary for a government to function. So I learned so much from that. I had a wonderful group of people, a rather small group. I think maybe we were 25, which now would be considered a good size league. But that was sort of the beginning, and I remember appearing before City Council. I remember one of the attorneys at the time, either on that board or said, "It's just amazing. I can't believe that people care that much about a community, to learn that much, the basics." It's really the basics. That's where a provisional league begins. Couldn't have done it without incredible, I think they may have been called sponsors. There may have been another term for it. Melissa DeKeefer from Boulder. I have a lifelong fondness for her as a mentor. Janet Roberts, a few of the others who were, and interestingly enough, Melissa's daughter, Kitty DeKeefer, is now with the Mental Health Center, and she has called me repeatedly to see if I wouldn't serve on their board, but I just can't fit in one more.
wonderful. So part of this history is that when a community decides, or a group of women decide to have a League of Women Voters, that there is a mentoring process
Absolutely.
that comes into play. And so the City of Boulder Longmont League was here also,
Right.
helping
right.
to build it with this very interested group of women. And the National League gave you the parameters of
Correct.
how
Correct.
you do this.
If I recall, it was a 2-year provisional period. And there's a lot of work to be done. You know, you begin with the Know Your Community. You had to meet certain requirements. I don't recall any of those right now, but that was all part of it.
And do you remember how this group of 25 women came together and said, "We need a League of Women Voters in Longmont"? Do you remember the motivation for it?
You know, I just remember that I came thinking, that's what we need. After my limited experience in Arvada, I just felt that, you know, this was an area that was important to a small community. So I just gathered people together. Charlotte Houston, the former Boulder County official, was one of my board
clerk,
members.
County clerk.
It was a list of the, you know, in a very strange way to say it, the who's who of women in Longmont. I mean, it was a small community, and I was privileged to be welcomed into this community. And I don't even know how we gathered. I suppose a notice in the Times Call, you know, saying that this was being formed and the purpose of the league, the mission of the league. And we just gathered together, and we had a wonderful friendship, and I think we accomplished a lot.
Well, good. In general, what are or were some of the unique characteristics of the Longmont League? You were saying this is a smaller community. I was wondering if, you know, in retrospect, you could see, wow, we were a little different this way, or...
At that time, I really do not recall any burning issues that we certainly faced at later times. I think because we were a growing community and it was evident that we were changing from a small agrarian community to something very, very different, because IBM then came, which had vast changes for our community. We began to attract businesses here. Because I was the first provisional president, my husband then received an assignment as a pilot for United Airlines. So we moved to California. I had to resign my position and move to California.
Oh my goodness.
And of course we were there I was just there for 9 months, came back, and then immediately became involved again in the league. And then it was in July I helped organize an enrichment program for children on split sessions. I came back and became very involved in the school system. I was co-chair of the Longmont Community Development Committee, and it was formed by a mutual agreement with the League and the Chamber of Commerce. So I thought that was sort of an interesting coalition at the time. I don't even remember too much about it. I served on the Head Start board, so all of those things began to meld together, I think. And then in 1971, I was appointed to the Boulder County Long Range Planning Commission. I think what happened for me, and I think it certainly happened for other league members, we really had learned a lot about the functioning of government, and if that's all you do, you never progress to the next stage, which is putting into practice what you learned. I was trying to find out when I was appointed to the state board, because I was on the state board of the League of Women Voters for quite a few years, and apparently my title was Public Relations Director. So that's why I worked all the time with the Denver Post, all the newspapers, for all the publicity. And at that time, we received a lot of publicity. It was very easy, because I think it was still in its infancy as far as educating voters at that time. And I had some very, very interesting experiences at that time. And I was also appointed the chair of the effort by the League to raise, I believe it was $11 million. And this was part of the anniversary celebration of the League. I know that that was in 1969, actually. That was shortly after I came back. And it was the 50th anniversary membership drive to raise $11 million. So that was, I was a director of the League from 1969 to 1974. During that period of time. So that was...
Could you expand a little on the work that you did? I mean, you're just following right through these questions. Expand a little on the work you did for the state, and what role the state played in just, I don't know whether if the right word is coordinating or liaison with the national.
Right. I coordinated all the publicity, but I also did lobbying at the state capitol, which was a very natural thing for me. I knew a lot of the legislators at that time, and we spent, we put again into practice the issues we felt were important. So I became very familiar with the state legislature at the time, and I found that fascinating. And so that was an interesting time, but at the same time, I was, I guess I really wasn't involved in the local level. I was still a den mother, and I was co-chair of the Council for Small Business in Longmont. So I sort of combined my interest in business and good economic development with the love for making sure that our government was good and strong.
Can you remember from those years at the state what some of the issues were at that time that the League of Women Voters advocated, or?
Well, it was, one of the ones that it just comes to my mind was the District of Columbia being able to vote. The League worked on that it's a very strong issue at the time, and of course that still hasn't been accomplished. So that was one of the things that I remember. And other than that, growth was not yet the big issue, which it was later. I think it was really a voter education, as I recall. That was really our focus. We did, when I see this pile of clippings that I apparently saved for some reason, it was very much, the League was respected for the nonpartisanship and informing citizens. We did a lot of publishing of pamphlets and distributing them. People wanted League information.
And this was at the state level?
That was at the state level.
And then they got disseminated.
They got to disseminate it to all
the league,
the local leagues.
All the local leagues.
Right.
Great. And you were very much a part of that.
I was very much a part of that. Yes.
Wow. So that publicity went into really education.
Right. Right. So
that's great. In terms of sort of the League here, could you just describe somewhat of how that group of women operated, decision making, how to deal with differences, how to gain new members and how to mentor new women? So just sort of in a nutshell how this league operated as its own group.
As I recall, it was a very amiable group. I really do not recall any real dissension. I think we have a tendency to, or I do at least, to sort of put the negative aside and deal with the positive. So I'm sure there was some. I think for many years later, as the league matured, I think there was, among many people, questioning how nonpartisan they were, you know, some of the decisions that they made, some of the issues that they took up. I think there began to have that that feeling is, are they really a nonpartisan group, or are they delving too closely into partisan politics? That we certainly never took positions on candidates. That was always our mantra. You know, we do not take position on candidates, but we take a position on issues. But it's hard to stay within that boundary. I think we're all human. And I think that's what probably happened as some of us became more involved in other than league activities. A natural progression, I think.
And do you remember at all in the years that you were active how you built membership? And
we never grew
outreach?
I may not remember the numbers, but I don't think we ever grew beyond maybe 50 members. And I think it was at that time, of course, you need to recall that most women did not work outside their homes. So it was much easier to get women who were interested to be a part of a group that they saw as being worthy and actually having accomplishments that had an impact on their community. So it was much easier at that time to get members. And yet, as I mentioned, some of us then started putting into practice what we had learned, so we were no longer active in the league.
So would you say that, at least for the League of Women Voters in Longmont, that it did provide somehow an education, a springboard to move into the truly public sphere and get involved in civic government activities?
Absolutely.
So
That's why I mentioned that, once I had sort of done everything in the league that I felt I could do, I decided then to really put into practice what I had learned. And I was I mentioned, I think in 1971, then I was co-chair of the Community Development Committee, and then I was appointed by the City Council and the Boulder County Commissioners to the Boulder County Planning Commission, and that was in 1971. And in 1973, I was appointed to the Longmont Charter Review Commission.
Wow.
Interestingly enough, Ron Stewart and I served together on that. And Ron then became a longtime commissioner and has been a full-time public servant and employee of the county. I was appointed to the Cable TV Study Committee. And in 1974, I was appointed to the Longmont Water Board. Once again, I was the first woman on there, and I served for 19 years on the Longmont Water Board.
Very important.
12
to the
of
West,
them,
huh?
I was chair. And I found that fascinating. Literally, I was mentored by the most brilliant water people. And I always said I still only had a thimbleful of knowledge, because it really gave Longmont a position that's almost unparalleled. Longmont has an adequate water supply for what we call the 100-year drought. And that is a water supply that if we had a drought that comes only once every 100 years and lasted for 7 years, Longmont has enough water to get their population through that drought. And so it was one of the rare committees that allowed people to continue on. Usually there are term limits, but they felt it took so much effort to learn the basics of water law and water that they just kept reappointing me. In fact, I had to resign then to run for mayor. So I would probably still be on the committee if it hadn't been for that. And I did not seek reappointment to the Boulder County Planning Commission at the time. And again, I think I may have been the first woman chair of that board. That was grueling, because that was during the putting together the Longmont, or the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan. And I would leave at noon and usually get home at 1 a.m. For those meetings. It was a grueling time of lengthy meetings and hashing out all that had to be done on that level of the comprehensive plan, because it was the first major comprehensive plan. So.
Yes, and probably one of, or say a pioneer in the United States
Right.
in terms
It
of
really was.
creating planning
Right.
around community development.
Right.
And I don't know, just community relations. So very, very important.
Right.
Could you, I know this is maybe pushing you a little bit here, but could you maybe isolate some of the qualities or, I don't know, background knowledge that you took from your experience of being in the League of Women Voters than into the subsequent civic work?
Well, I think it certainly prepared me for the background necessary. I always encourage potential candidates to start at the bottom. Many people always want to start at the top, but they forget that someone who's well-grounded has a background that is so essential in decision making. And I guess one of the things from the League that I will always treasure is that they always taught us that you must have both the pros and cons of an issue before you make up your mind. And I think that's very, very simple. It should be done in all areas of our life if you stop to think about it, because it's just better that you have some idea. There are always two sides to every issue, and sometimes many more sides than two. So I think that was one of the things that, you know, had really been instilled in me, that it was important to do your homework. Many of the boards and commissions I served on, people would always say, well, I didn't read the minutes, but I know Leona did, so if she approves them, it's all right. Now that's a sad commentary, but homework takes a lot of effort and time, and it's just not something you can glance at and then appear at a meeting and be well prepared. So I think those were some of the things that the League helped me to remember, that I needed to do my homework and I needed to speak from a basis of as much knowledge as I could gather.
So the League, in part, was almost like a college of
Absolutely.
a democracy of how a democracy should work.
Right.
And
it really was.
And what an informed citizen should be like.
Right. An informed citizen is really the key.
Another area I wanted to look at, because you have mentioned a number of times, I believe I was the first woman. There was a video done in the late 90s with Janet Roberts and Ruth Carell. And it was about sort of the women's participation in political life, basically. And they both attributed the League of Women Voters as an institution or a group, whatever, that provided important opportunities for women to learn about politics and as a gateway into political life. Do you draw those connections yourself then, that the League in this particular point in history, you know, was kind of a segue into, you know, local politics, maybe even state politics, county politics?
I think it definitely was. I don't know that I got those skills from the League, but one thing I found quite interesting in all the years that I had always seemed to be ending up with the chairmanship or the presidency was that I didn't seek them, and men seemed not to find me threatening. I was not what many would have described the rabid woman pioneer who, you know, who was extremely vocal and insisting upon her rights. But men have always told me that they never felt threatened by my being in leadership. And they were always the ones who nominated me for positions. So I was pleased about that, because that's the type of person I am. We all have different personalities, and that just happens to be my personality. I'm not threatening to people. So, and that served me extremely well when I was mayor.
Very, very interesting way to describe yourself in terms of getting and living into a male-dominated system and actually transforming that system by your very presence, actually. So maybe it says something about the way politics should operate, especially at the local level. Also, we did talk a little bit about issues of concern in Longmont that the League worked on. Would you be willing to talk about whether you found one particular issue that the League brought up for you and that you really latched onto and really worked with over the years?
I think it probably would be planning, planning growth, because we could see in our community that we were on the cusp of change. And it's very important that you plan well. And I suppose then it was natural with the County Planning Commission, and then I didn't serve on the Longmont Planning Commission, but obviously was very familiar. I think when you're exposed to all of that, then you're interested in absolutely every aspect of your community. Culturally, I served on the Head Start Board, as I had mentioned. There just wasn't an area of the city that I wasn't involved in some way. Extremely involved in the arts, culture. I was at the time before our fabulous symphony came along, I was on the board of the Music Association, where we brought in, really very quality performers to Longmont. And that's a big step for a community that is just growing. But it's all part. I don't think you can have a healthy community without having sort of that self-sufficiency that comes with really having events, opportunities for our community to grow, both spiritually, culturally, all of those things to me are part of a healthy community. So getting traffic off of Main Street was something that the league not necessarily worked on, but it was a very hot issue. To this day, 100 some years later, we still have, and will always have probably, a state highway, a federal highway system going through Main Street. I serve on the Longmont Downtown Development Association board, still working to make that wonderful downtown business friendly, but at the same time pedestrian friendly. So traffic issues, one of the issues I know that the league was involved in was in order to facilitate some of that issue that we had that we didn't seem to be able to change, was to have one-way streets on Kimbark and Kaufman. Well, if you want to bring out the crowd and the hostilities, you take on an issue like that. And that has, to this day, we haven't solved that problem. You just mitigate it. You can't solve some things. So that was, that was very interesting. I think it was also then that I became, I was an election judge forever until I ran for public office. When you can no longer do that during that period. But I think I ran, I said to my husband one day, I've been on every board and commission. I may as well run for mayor. And that's literally what what happened.
You want to talk a little bit about then? So it started with the League of Women Voters, and then, as you said, you just went on so many boards and commissions, and being on the Planning Commission gave you this sort of intimate knowledge and enthusiasm for Longmont, and all aspects of potential. And then you ran.
Well, I did.
Mayor, and you won.
Well, I think it was a 5-way race, my first effort in running, and I won by 53% of the vote in a 5-way race. But I did just what I had always done. I don't think there were many houses in Longmont that I did not knock on their door. And I did not do what many people do, telling them about me so much. But I sent out surveys, probably from my league background. I sent out surveys to everyone I knew before I announced, asking for their input of what they felt were the issues that were important to Longmont. And I got a lot of them back. So I started out having a pretty good idea of what the citizenry wanted. I think I also handed out cards to everyone and let people just that I met on the street tell me what they wanted. So I have a feeling that, that helped, that I was listening instead of talking, which some of our politicians could learn from today. And I also went into it, which is probably two different things. My husband and I had agreed, and I think it's extremely important to have the backing of your family if you have a family, because I don't think it's possible to really do a good job unless you have that support. And I always say the family's the smallest unit of government, and if you don't have your act together there, it's hard for you to tell everyone else what to do. So I went into it as a servant. I truly felt, and I feel that to this day, that as an elected officer of any local, state, or national, you should truly be a servant to the people. And I had ice cream socials. I just availed myself to the people, and I truly did it full time. And in Longmont, I'm still very pleased that the mayor is elected by the people, which I think is extremely important, because you have the entire community then feeling that they had a say in who the mayor of the community is. And then the second and third time I ran, I was elected just before term limits went into effect. So I'm the only person that will ever have served 8 years as mayor. Most of them were 2 or 3 years. But I was able to go beyond the 6 years, which it would be now, and serve 8 years. So I had plenty of opportunity to really become aware of what was going on in the community. And my fourth race then, I think it was another 4 or 5 opponents that I had, and I received 73% of the vote. So by then, I knew my community wanted me here, and I had tremendous connections in all parts of the community. I mean, I was as welcomed in the Hispanic community as I was in any other. So I felt very, very good about it, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
And it probably was more than a full-time job.
It was more than. I used to say I put in 60 to 80 hours. Wherever people wanted me, I was there. My husband went when he thought there would be good food, and if he didn't think it was very good, he stayed contentedly at home. And I still baked homemade bread, because that's been my little specialty. The Denver Post did a full 1.5-page article about, and I don't remember what the headline was, but something like, "The mayor has dough," or something, it had my bread recipes and such in it.
The future homemakers of America.
Apparently it goes all the way back to that. I baked the biscuits, and now I bake the bread.
Becomes the mayor who bakes.
I gave away and still do an enormous amount of bread. In fact, I was president of the Imagine Foundation, which is my passion now. The Center for People with Cognitive Disabilities. And I must have gotten that love for people who are the dearest, but need a lot of help. And 2 years ago, I was asked to do a loaf of bread a month for a year as an auction item, and it brought $1,500. And so I'm on my third year of doing that. And so, I use that talent too.
Isn't that interesting how we can use our talents to build a community?
In a little way. And I know that I've received honors because of that bread making. One of my friends, I think at the time it might have been the Boulder Camera, who wrote about, if someone's ill or someone dies, I take a loaf of bread. It's what I can do in a simple way to share my love for others. So it's, just one of those funny little things that meaningless perhaps, but I think it has meaning to some people.
I think it's very basic to human existence. So to that, to give homemade food, and especially, the symbol of bread is overpowering. To bring you back to the league one more time at least, would you say that your philosophy of governing, running for office, your approach to being the servant of the people, do you see that as related to any league approaches to democracy?
I think
Could you relate it to
Yeah.
kind of what you saw other women in the organization believe, or?
I don't know. I suppose we're a product of so many parts of our lives, and I think my compassion certainly came from my family, my faith. I mean, the League just helped immensely in preparing me, I think, to take on these roles. The others are, all of those other attributes, where do they come from? They're just a part of your being, I think.
Yeah, but the sort of the bottom-up approach to democracy.
Right, it is.
That's kind of a League
really
approach,
is.
isn't it?
It is. It very much is. And of course, the moment I finished, was term limited, I was immediately asked to run for the state legislature.
Wow.
And at the time, I had I'm a bicyclist. I love to bicycle. And I had a bicycle crash, and I had a neck injury. And this is totally unrelated in one way. And I had surgery and had to wear the collar. But because in those intervening years, I had a business it was Personal and Professional Development. I taught classes for little children, little girls, which is my very favorite thing, of etiquette, time management, conversational skills, and wardrobe planning. I also did that for adult men and women. And I did that for 20 years, all during this same time. And then I was a national trainer. I taught instructors of how to do this in their various communities, from Alaska to all over the country. But I did that all I had a studio in my home at the other house. And as a result of that, I still have, in fact, I was called yesterday by one of my students. They don't look the same as they did when they were 9 to 12-year-olds. And apparently they still consider me a mentor in their lives. Little things like the basics of etiquette, which unfortunately isn't taught anymore in business, and it's desperately needed. But they felt comfortable going to an IBM function with the dignitaries because of simple things like how to hold their napkins, how to fold their napkins, which is sort of interesting. But I had been so involved in the arts, and when I had this neck injury, I always had lovely scarves over my neck. And the last night, the last night of my mayoral term, I took this goose, a decoy under my arm, because I had been to an event where I had to wear a costume. And a friend of mine, whom we usually called my evil twin, had taken this decoy, put a collar around it, just like my collar, under the desk at my seat in the council chambers. And when I gave my farewell address, I'm sure people assumed it was going to be very emotional. And I took this critter out and put it on my head. It was actually a goose on my head. And of course it made the headlines of the newspapers, not only in Longmont. But it was a very humorous way to end. But this was the beginning of the project, the arts project, like the cows in New York, and actually started in Switzerland. And my co-chair and I did the Goose Project. And we had the 6-foot geese, 3 feet wide, that 23 artists painted. We had a big event and sold the completed geese. And they're all over Longmont. We have 11 remaining out of the 23 that we had. They were purchased by people outside of our community. And my husband at the time said to me, "You must make your choice of whether you want to be Mother Goose or the next State House representative." So at the same time that I was campaigning for the State House, I was also working with this art project. And you may recall that 10 years ago was when reapportionment, was happening. I testified before the State House repeatedly on keeping Longmont whole. And of course, it's all done according to the census, the numbers of people that are allowed. And because of an unfortunate incident that we'll never really know what happened, but Longmont seemed to be the scapegoat, and Longmont was divided. And I had a good portion of Boulder. My children, who lived just a few blocks from me, could not vote for me in Longmont. And I did my usual. I went to every door in Boulder in my district. I had a wonderful time. I love door-to-door, being with people. And unfortunately, that was my first run as a party, a partisan, in partisan politics. And being a Republican in Boulder is not the most, it's not the easiest thing to do. Though I had many, many Boulder connections and had much support in Boulder, I lost by 500 votes. But only 23% of the Republicans voted because they assumed I was a shoo-in. I had just breezed through every election. But I was not unhappy because I had plenty of other items to work on, so that was not. However, I recall at the time that the Denver Post, in endorsing me, said I was one of the most highly qualified candidates they had ever seen. Well, obviously, most people don't serve on as many committees. Most people have not been the mayor, most people. So I certainly would attribute my qualifications at that time, even though it was more a partisan and as a result of the fact that they had literally gerrymandered, though we try not to use that term. And the testimony I gave night before last was to make Longmont whole again so that we could have our own representative.
Yeah, I was just remembering reading about, we're at that point from the census again,
yes,
right?
We're doing that right this minute, and it's, Longmont is too large to have just one, and so we have to take some of our people and put them in another district, but we're at least hoping the preliminary map will be whole. Longmont will be virtually whole. So that was another wonderful era that I felt well prepared for.
You have mentioned thus far that you do have a family, and probably in the 1960s it was a younger family.
Right.
Over the years, as you point out, women have not necessarily chosen to devote themselves to volunteer organizations because they need to work, and the juggling continues. How have you managed to do so much juggling, obviously with your career in public service, having a family,
right,
having a business,
right,
that all,
right. Well, people claim that I have supernatural energy. I don't, but I do. I'm extremely healthy, and I do have a lot of energy. And our children would never have dared not voted. I mean, they were voters. They were, they have all been involved in the political process. It was so much a part of our lives that they wouldn't dare not to have participated. And so I think I always had that priority of my family. Coming from a home where I didn't have that precious mother, I recognized how important it was to have a strong family. And I don't know how I did it. I remember I played the piano for a cherub choir. And I remember that I only missed one time when I had my youngest son. And then when he was just old enough to be in a seat, he sat next to me as I played the piano. And so I guess I involved the children in everything I did. They campaigned with me. And by the time I was on my last, I even had some grandchildren. And I think that the photo that I used in these wonderful brochures were of, we all had the same colored shirts on. That was part of my training in how to do wardrobe planning. And I know when I ran for the State House, I remember the lieutenant governor, I think, that came, and he said, this is the same kind of an event that a gubernatorial candidate would have, and you are running for the State House. So I had so many friends who helped in so many ways. It was an absolute joy to be a part of that. So.
That's wonderful. We are getting to the end of time, and I was wondering if you had any further sort of reflections on the League. I know it became part of the Boulder League, which then subsequently changed its name in 2007 to
the Boulder Valley. Yeah.
Well, now it's actually the League of Women Voters of Boulder County. So, any reflections on the League and its future? And
well, because I put into practice what I learned, I was no longer active in the League.
Right.
And I was talking with Mary Blue, a friend of mine, and she is no longer active either. And I don't know whether we outgrow the League or what it is, because I think it's sort of the living example that you have. And I don't always agree with the positions they take, which is fine. You know, that's all part of it. So for me, it's not, I wouldn't say it isn't relevant anymore, but it isn't a part of what I'm doing now in my life. I came back after all of that and, you know, have become very involved. I'm completing my 9th year on the hospital board, which is 3 meetings usually a month at 6:30 a.m. And that's where I'm going again at noon today. And then the Imagine Foundation takes a great deal of my time.
and that is Boulder County, isn't it?
That's Boulder and Broomfield County. And I was the foundation president, and we are charged individually to raise at least $15,000 a year. And I'm most proud of the smart homes, which we have, world-renowned, one in Longmont and one in Boulder. And so I spend a great deal of my time now working with these wonderful people who have cognitive disabilities and can lend my expertise. It's the connections that I have that are most valuable to that organization. When I told them I could no longer take on one more board position, they said, "You don't have to do anything. We just want your connections." Well, I have lots of those, but I'm not a person that lends my name. I'm a worker bee, and so I prefer to get down and do the dirty work. And so it's a joy to be known. Unfortunately, my husband said, as you see in that article, that if he had just a percentage of what I've gathered for other nonprofits, he could be wealthy and live in the style he'd like to become accustomed.
Well, I guess if you're ready, we could either continue this or we could end it here. And
whatever you wish, if you have other things that you...
Well, because of our focus, I suspect you need a whole nother oral history just on your public service in Longmont. But I think this really has expanded our understanding of what can happen to women who really work with the League of Women Voters. And just had one last question. When you ran for mayor, did the League of Women Voters hold a forum?
Yes, they did. Of course they did.
Well, I'm glad they did that for you.
Yes, and they always, in conjunction with the Longmont Daily Times Call. And they still do to this day.
Right.
So that is the one thing that I still see those same league people that were involved from the very beginning. They're handing out the brochures and handing out the basic league information, and and that is always a big event. I certainly, appreciated that and still do. I always attend. My husband and I always attend those, because even though I spend now most of my time developing leadership for the future. because every candidate who is even considering running always comes, and I spend time with them. I try to educate them on, what they need to do to be successful.
Thank you so